right, welcome to another MBTI type interaction. I'm Celebok and I'm an ISTP, and I am talking with yet another INFJ because we can never get too many INFJs. I'm talking with Fay Wray from YouTube, which I'm really excited about because I discovered her channel a few months ago, and I found that I really I related a lot to her videos, like her story and about her study of MBTI and also her journey on her Christian faith, which I guess we may or may not get to that during this talk. So I don't really have a specific agenda, but just to get us started, Fay Wray, why don't you just introduce yourself? Tell us how you got interested in MBTI and stuff like that.
Okay, well, it's something I've known about for a long time, but it's only been more recently that I started getting in depth. I actually first took an MBTI test when I was a freshman in college, and I believe that it was the official test.
Oh, okay.
It told me I was an INTP.
Okay.
It was funny because the guy I was dating at the time and I both took it, and we both got INTP as the result. And I'm definitely not an INTP, and I believe he is also not an INTP. So, so that wasn't actually accurate. And so that didn't really, so I knew what Myers-Briggs was, and I knew about the personality types. I knew what the different types were because I did read a little bit about it. I found it interesting. I remember talking to a couple other people at school about, oh, you took it too, what's your type, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't until, I guess it was probably several years later, and I can't remember how this happened. It was probably like an online test because okay. There are so many of those, but I started getting INTJ as my result consistently.
Okay.
So for many years, I really believed that I was an INTJ. And, I would read the descriptions, and enough of it I would identify with that I didn't have any reason to doubt that result. I think there are a lot of similarities between INTJs and INFJs because you share a dominant function. And so
yeah.
That's, so the differences are more subtle between those two types. And so there was never any kind of red flag of this is completely inaccurate or anything like that. It wasn't until I started learning about the cognitive functions that I ever doubted that. And that was probably a little over a year ago that I actually learned about the cognitive functions for the first time. And I think I just started watching YouTube videos. For some reason, it was easier listening to people talk about the cognitive functions and what they meant.
Oh, yeah.
And that led me to start looking at various websites and trying to gather information because I found it very fascinating because it had to do with how people's minds actually work. It wasn't just this person has this personality, that person has that. It was really getting under the surface of that, which is what I find interesting. And so, so even after reading about the cognitive functions, I still thought I was an INTJ for a while. And what happened is that my understanding of introverted thinking, well, my understanding of extroverted thinking and introverted feeling, which at the time I thought were my preferences because I thought I was an INTJ, my understanding of those functions was skewed by the fact that I was just comparing it to myself and being like, oh, this is what I do, therefore this must be what extroverted thinking is, this must be what introverted feeling is. Okay. And I didn't really, it didn't strike me immediately that there was something, because I think the cognitive functions can be quite hard to describe in a way that somebody can look at it and immediately, you have to almost go to different sources and read it described in different ways, I think.
Yeah.
At least I did. Some people might be different. I don't know.
Yeah, well, because like there's so many people who get it wrong. There's so many like
Right.
misleading descriptions, so that's
That's true.
yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So I actually did get led down a wrong path, reading some of people's descriptions of extroverted thinking versus introverted thinking, um, and I think it started to become a sort of growing hunch for me that there was something amiss, that I didn't seem to be. I knew there was something I wasn't grasping, and but I couldn't really put my finger on what. And then finally, I started reading descriptions of introverted feel. Like specifically remember a description, reading a description of introverted feeling versus extroverted feeling, where it said, you know, extroverted feelers reveal their inner state to people; they can't really hold back. Whereas introverted feelers, they just show what they want to show. And
Mm.
I remember reading that and thinking, there are people who can do that. That was fascinating to me. I can't imagine having that much control over, what I reveal to people as far as my emotional state. I tend to be expressive, and I've always had people tell me that. And when I thought about it, I realized that there were people that I actually had trouble reading. And I was like, they must all be introverted feelers, and that explains so much. But to me, it wasn't obvious that I was good at reading other people's emotions, because that's never been an area that I've had a lot of confidence. But once I started reading more descriptions of what extroverted feeling actually entails, I realized that that is something I'm actually able to do. And that was something that I thought was just intuition, but I started understanding that when it comes to reading people, that's actually more extroverted feeling. And so I started to understand that was something that I could actually do. Except for introverted feelers, I find more challenging. But I can generally pick up on how people are responding to me, for example, and then sort of adjust how I'm presenting something or how I'm telling a story or something based on the reaction that I'm getting. It was actually Pneumoceptor's description of being able to do that as an INFJ that I recognized that ability in myself. I was like, I'm actually able to do that as well, and I just never. I never thought. I'm not a super social person, and I'm extremely introverted, and so I never had a lot of confidence in that area of being like good with people. But when I really thought about how I interact with people, I realized that that was something that I was able to do. And so eventually I started to think that I was an INFJ, which was a surprise to me, because I think the reason I was always testing as INTJ was because of my own perception of myself as more of a thinker than a feeler. I don't think of myself as an emotional person. I realize now that with Myers-Briggs, that's not what feeling actually means. That's not what feeling types actually are. But I think that the questions on a lot of the online assessments actually do, at least, they imply that sometimes in a way that might lead someone to answer questions in a particular way.
Yeah.
So they'll say something like, "Are you more likely to make a decision based on reason or your feeling about it?" And I'll say reason, because I don't make decisions based on my emotions. But if it was phrased in another way, where it was like, how much do your values play into it, or how much does your intuition play into it, or something like that, then I might answer differently. But you've talked about that a bit, about how the questions, depending on what you bring to it, that you can interpret them in different ways, and that can skew the results of the test. So that
Yeah.
definitely happened to me as well.
Yeah. And I'm guessing human metrics test was probably one of them.
Yeah,
Um,
I took that one.
yeah, everyone makes fun of it, including me.
I know, I've seen your video of that. It's awesome.
Yeah, because it's the first test. It's the first thing that comes up when you Google personality test, and so that's the one everyone takes.
It has to be the reason why there are so many mistyped people. I blame
Yeah,
human metrics because I don't. I mean, probably a lot of the tests are pretty inaccurate, but it is remarkable how what a process people can go through to determine their true type, and how a lot of people who don't go through that process will just remain mistyped and have no idea.
yeah, and like I think you're saying you tested as INTJ like consistently every time, and
Yep.
I think the general consensus about that one test is that it's biased toward INTJ. Like there are a lot of people who mistype as
Really?
INTJ. Yeah, because the questions, because well, I know people who think that the test was written by an INTJ, and so they try to write,
Oh.
so they write questions like try to get at how would a sensor answer this, and they get it wrong. So like a
Yeah,
lot of
there is a lot of bias in those tests. I
yeah.
think that they're all written by intuitives, from what I can tell. I think
Mm,
that in general, um, you actually just said something really interesting, and I think it was in an interaction video. Um, did you just do one with NF Geeks?
yeah.
I think it was on that you were talking about how you would interpret the questions as a sensor. Like the idea of big picture. Are you there?
Oh, yeah, I think I lost you for about
You
10
froze for a
seconds.
minute. Yeah. So in the interaction with NF Geeks, you were talking about interpreting the questions as a sensor, and how you might read a question like, do you see the big picture? And you would say yes because you see the big picture, but that you realize now that the way an intuitive sees the big picture is different from the
Yeah,
way a sensor sees a big picture, because a sensor will just compile all these different sensory details and put them together and say, okay, let's take the sum total of these details. That's the big picture, whereas an intuitive is going to abstract from these details and create something new and different from what the sensory details even are. Or they might not
yeah.
even be dealing much with sensory details, really. They're kind of
Hmm.
looking past that sometimes. And so that was really interesting to me to see. And an intuitive who wrote that question would never think, I mean, to them it's obvious what big picture means, and they
Yeah,
wouldn't think, they were like, well, of course that's an abstract view. They wouldn't think, oh, you can just, so things like that, you can really see how a different interpretation can lead people to answer questions
yeah,
differently.
yeah. And the same thing with thinker versus feeler. Like if you're a thinker,
Yeah,
you don't know how a feeler approaches decisions, then it's like well to the thinker, the feeler is acting based on feelings, but the feeler
right.
wouldn't see it that way. Or like
Yeah.
that one question that says, do you get emotionally involved with TV soaps? How many people are going to say yes to that?
Well, there are things like that. There are questions like that that are just completely absurd, because you're right. Like that's um, there are plenty of people who have just never even watched a soap opera, and so how are they supposed to answer that question?
Yeah.
You know, or maybe it's something they don't want to admit, that if I am going to be watching a soap opera, which I haven't done since I was a kid, um, I don't even know if they're even still on television or not, but um, but if I were, I just know from my experience with TV in general that if I were to watch a soap opera, I would get involved with the characters probably, um, but I wouldn't want to. I don't have a lot of experience watching soap operas, so I might not answer that question yet. Yes. And I'm
Yeah.
not really the type of person who watches soap operas, so even if I had a memory of being a kid and my mom was watching a soap opera that I got kind of involved in it, that wouldn't be enough of a reason for me to be like, oh yeah, I totally get into soap opera. It just seems like a
Yeah.
stupid question to me, but
Yeah. The one thing I'm curious about though is the very first time you took the test, you said you got INTP.
yeah,
Um,
I don't know what that. I actually have a theory about that, but
oh,
why that happened.
well, yeah, I want to hear it. Why do you think that might have happened?
Well, I was 18 years old, and I was in an extremely rigid environment. I was at a Christian college
Oh, yeah.
that was all about everything being black and white and everything being about, you know, totally rigid, right answer to this question. There's no, you can't consider any other possibilities type of thing. And, you know, with my dominant function, a perceiving function, I think I do answer some questions more the way, I don't actually even understand why INFJs are considered judgers, actually. But the idea that I would get, you know, and I don't know how those tests determine that final thing of like whether you're a judge or perceiver, especially considering that there are people whose dominant function is a perceiving function who are considered judgers by MBTI. I'm just not sure how any of those things are determined by the assessment, but looking back, I can imagine that the way I would have answered a lot of those questions, like just knowing what I know about the MBTI test, that they try to determine whether you're a judge or perceiver based on, like, do you like to keep your options open? Do you see, you know, things in terms of black and white or more in terms of whatever? Like, I could see myself answering those questions as a perceiver would, so I could see how that might skew the result in that case.
Okay. Because I'm thinking that, you know, I'm like getting back to the human metrics test. That one seems like very biased towards judgers, because I guess the perceiver questions on that just makes perceivers sound like just really irresponsible, like we're always late and and like always messy. Well, in my case that's true, but yeah, but I noticed that is the only test nowadays that still tests me as a judger. Like every other test gets it right. And so I think it is the wording of the question that say, like, you know, you're more open-ended and, you know, open to possibilities. So that kind of like paints perceivers in a slightly more, you know, neutral light. And so it's
the neutrality is important, because there's no question that that bias plays into how we answer questions about ourselves. Like, nobody wants to admit that they're a slob, or most people don't, you know, or that they're, you know, like, and again, I'm still not sure why I'm a judger exactly. Like, this is actually something that's different in socionics, which I don't know very much about, but I know in socionics that it's more accurate in that if your dominant function is a perceiving function, then you're considered a perceiver. So in socionics, I'm an INFP. So yeah, I kind of feel in between when it comes to the whole judger perceiver thing.
Yeah. Well, pretty much all I know is, like, in Myers-Briggs, it's just defined as you're a judger if your extroverted function is a judging function. So in other words, you're judging in your external world.
Yeah. It's just, to me, that my auxiliary function just doesn't play as much into my decisions that I make, or in terms of, I don't know, it just doesn't, to me, I don't see how I use extroverted feeling much except in my interactions with people. And in my interactions with people, I can be different from how I am, you know, when I'm just, you know, making a decision just as an individual. So I see their logic behind why they do it that way, but I don't know. But I'm not sure I'm typical in that regard. So.
Well, so let me ask you, when you take these, does your introversion usually kind of score like pretty close to 100%?
Oh yeah,
okay.
Totally. That's consistent. That's actually consistent.
Okay, yeah, same with me.
It's very, you know, I actually have, in the last 2 or 3 years, I'm probably a little less introverted than I was up until that point.
Okay.
I make more of an effort to connect with people now than I ever did before. But I'm still really introverted, definitely.
Right. So I mean, the reason I asked that is because I think recently, I think it was Nick from NF Geeks who was talking about that, about how for introverts, figuring out the J versus P is a lot harder because your dominant function is your introverted function. And so, like, he's an INFJ, but he'll typically test right on the border between J and P. Like, for the longest time,
Oh, okay.
he thought he was an INFP, or he couldn't figure out, between INFJ or INFP, which are, obviously two very different types. But, it's hard to figure out if you're an introvert, for that very reason.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of it can be tricky things like that, making those determinations. I think for me, I know I still remember looking at my results for the very first test that I took, which I believe was the official test. I still remember, unsurprisingly, that at the time it was like 100% introverted, and I was like, well, yeah, because I'm like the most reclusive person that I know, so that doesn't surprise me. And especially at 18. At 18, I was really very shy. I did outgrow a lot of the shyness. Shyness and introversion, of course, being kind of two different things, but they're sometimes
Oh boy.
conflated. But
Yeah.
but
Oh boy.
but I tend to be on the border with thinking and feeling. So even though I would consistently test as INTJ, it was never like, it was still always pretty borderline. It would always just be like, if you look at the actual scales, which I know are not particularly meaningful necessarily, but it would tend to be sort of just over the line, just enough to get me as a thinker, as then a feeler. So
So I mean, when you were testing as INTJ, though, I mean, you saw that there was a borderline score between T and F. Was it? I mean, did you question? I mean, did you investigate, like, like whether you could be an INFJ, or was it just like, oh yeah,
no,
INTJ? Okay, so it's just
yeah,
like
no.
INTJ is it?
Yeah, I have to say, one of the reasons I never actually considered INFJ as a possibility. Um, Again, because I didn't think of myself as a feeler. Um, and when I would read the descriptions, like the descriptions of INFJs, when you go to different sites and read sort of a summation of this is what this type is all about, there was never anything about the INFJ descriptions that jumped out at me as, oh, that's totally me.
Hmm.
It just didn't. A lot of times they'll really emphasize um, the relational stuff, and that's less significant to me, I
Yeah.
think. It's because I am so introverted that it just it just didn't jump out at me, the INFJ descriptions. I have since then, with exploring the different, on the different forums and things like that, I have come across a couple of INFJ descriptions that were, uncanny with how accurate they were and how much I identified with them. I think this is part of the problem. Like, as an INFJ, for me to read a personality description that's very general and very sort of like, this could apply to, it's almost like a horoscope. It's sort of like, well, this could apply to anybody type of thing.
Yeah.
And for me, like, I don't identify with something unless I can really see the nuance, of it. And, a lot of the more popular sites that have the different personality descriptions, they try, but I just don't find them to be particularly nuanced.
Hmm.
And so when I've searched a little bit more, I have found descriptions on some of the more, it's just in random places where it would go into great detail and it would go in depth. And, this is what you're all about. This is how your mind works. This is, this is what, and that I would find to be so much more, I would identify with it so much more.
Yeah. But this is after you figured out you're an INFJ, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you think it's just because you went looking for INFJ descriptions?
Yeah, I think that's true, because I do think there are variations within each type. And so I think that there are legitimate INFJs in terms of their cognitive functions who might read a description that I really identified with, who would not identify with it quite so much.
Mm-hmm.
Because it does depend, I think, on how you're using your functions and what kind of experiences you've had in life, and just there are other factors at work besides just personality.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's how it was for me too. Like, first time I ever tested as ISTP, and it was like one of those stupid, it was either a Facebook test or something, something that just did not even sound serious at all. Like I think it labeled the ISTP as a criminal. So I was like, okay, that's
really,
yeah. And then I think after that I think I looked up like one like ISTP description for real, and I had all this typical stuff about motorcycles and fixing cars and extreme sports, skydiving. Yeah. So I was like, okay, that's not me at all. And so I just kind of like dismissed
exactly.
it.
That's what irritates me about those designations, those single word designations for the type, because not all ISTPs are mechanics.
Yeah.
Or even mechanically inclined. And the thing that bothers me about the INFJ, the counselor, is, again, that's saying that your entire personality type is how you relate to others. Mm-hmm. And that's just, I can take on that role when I am relating to someone, when I am having a conversation with someone, when a friend is asking me for advice or something. That feels very natural for me to go into that mode of empathy and trying to, encourage somebody or something like that. But that's just not, if I was counseling people all the time, I would be completely drained. Like, I would not be able to function. I just can't interact with people that much of the time that I would ever say, this is the predominant thing about my type, is that I counsel other people. But I believe there are INFJs that actually are, excellent counselors. They actually are able to tap into some kind of social energy where they're able to, but to me, I just would not be able to interact with people that much of the time.
Yeah, it depends on your experience, your environment.
Yeah.
Things you've had to do in life.
Well, yeah, I think the training that you receive to do something like that, like I'm an editor, and there are things that I do as an editor that go against my type and that I find draining. That's why it feels like work. That's why the things we do for work, feels like work and not like fun, because it requires energy to do it, So there are aspects of editing I find to be very intuitive. Like, my approach to language is very intuitive, and so that feels very natural to me. But when I'm having... Yeah, and but when there are certain things I have to do that are more just kind of remembering details. I'm not very detail oriented, so that's more challenging for me. But because I've been trained to do that, I can do it.
Yeah.
It's just not as fun to me as the just kind of intuitively going through a manuscript and reading it and just letting things sort of jump out at me. Like, to be more methodical, which I do have to do, that's more draining to me, but I can do it. So
yeah. So another thing that struck me is so like you have less experience like using your extroverted feeling, and so do you so there's this one theory, I'm not even sure how much I agree with it or how much other people relate to it, but have you heard of the dominant tertiary loop?
No.
It's where if you have like very few opportunities to use your auxiliary function. I think this only someone said it only applies to introverts. So
Okay.
if you're only using your dominant and tertiary function, and you have like no opportunities to use your extrovert auxiliary function, then you get stuck in this loop where it's like your dominant and tertiary functions, like in your case Ni and Ti, which are actually the same for me. They just
Oh
kind of like
yeah.
they just feed off of each other, and you're just totally
Yeah.
just into your just kind of like thinking about these intuitive thoughts, and then not
Yeah,
doing
that
anything with
pretty
them.
much describes my experience.
Yeah.
Um, that was one of the things that was really helpful for me in learning about this stuff is I could see, um, I'd sort of come to certain conclusions about, um, that's one of the reasons I started making more of an effort to connect with other people is because I could see that this wasn't particularly healthy to spend so
Okay.
much time in my head. I think it might be different if I were talented or creative in a way that I was able to create something productive with this kind of, constant thinking about stuff, but that was not really the case. And it was just became quite a sterile process. And it wasn't really productive in any way, I didn't think. And I was kind of hitting a wall with it. And I realized, I should probably try to find a way to, and could get quite depressed, I could get quite, because I was so isolated. So I went through periods in my adult life where I would really cut myself off from other people. And, um, that wasn't always healthy, and I could see that, like, that became apparent to me. And so I did start to try um to uh to expand my horizons a little bit as far as interacting with people more.
Hmm.
So, and now it's something I prioritize more.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. I was just gonna ask if since learning that you're an INFJ, if you found like what ways that you can actually use that to your benefit, or use that knowledge and find
Yeah,
ways find things about yourself that you didn't even know you were good at.
yeah, absolutely. It's helpful in that it's given me confidence in areas where I didn't really have them before. Um, you know, I'm old enough that I already had a fair degree of self-knowledge when I started learning about this stuff, but it helped coalesce um, a lot of things so that I was just more sure of myself. Uh, because um, one of the things with introverted intuition, I think, is that you're looking to settle somewhere, you're looking to come to knowledge, but it's not this like really concrete thing, so you can uh, you can sort of end up, I know for me, like, my tendency has been more self-doubt, um, and learning about something that's like a model that I can kind of measure it against my own experiences and see how valid it is. And if I find that, this is actually fairly valid and that I can compare it to my own experiences, and, as far as being an INFJ, I can read about this and read about the cognitive functions and think this really is how I process information, or this really is how I come to decisions about things. And it has helped me, I think, yeah, and just sort of like I was saying about with my work, that I had already come to these conclusions because I had a job previous to my current job it was just like all SI and TE all the time, and I just was really, it was a job that should have been really great on paper, but in terms of the practical application, I just was not good at it, and that became really obvious to me. And so I did figure that out, and I did figure out what I would be better at. But then reading about Myers-Briggs actually helped me fit it into a model that explained it a little bit more about how my mind works and why there are certain things that I'm going to find more challenging. You know, most of the people I worked with were INFPs or ESTJs. They found it a lot easier, I think, to do this job where you were just having to just like be very detail oriented and do things like the same way every time, follow like really exact procedures and things like that. That's really challenging for me. So now I understand better why, and it helps me. Like if I had to do something different career-wise in the near future, I would be much better informed as far as what kind of strengths and weaknesses I have.
Yeah, and you can actually answer those things in interviews. So
Which had always totally befuddled me before. I was like, I don't know, I have no idea.
Yeah, I discovered that like last year when I was interviewing. I was talking to this one recruiter, and she asked me like, do you know what your strengths and weaknesses are? And I was like, oh, yeah, I know what mine are. And she was surprised that I actually knew the answer to that question. And this is
That's like great.
Yeah, this is like just a few months after I started learning about Myers-Briggs and learning about being an ISTP, what my strengths and weaknesses were. So I just thought that was kind of funny.
Totally.
But yeah, I actually remember you talking about that in a couple of your videos, and like your job situation, how you figured out that you were in a job that wasn't really suited to your strengths, and and I had I totally related to that video too, because like I've being my career as a software engineer, or where I'm like developing software. I worked full time for Microsoft for 6 years, and so we were just developing this new product. And it's looking back now, I can see it was very suited to INTPs and INTJs.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So people who can use their intuition to come up with all these new innovative ideas, come up with like new ways of implementing, like writing code to make things either more efficient or just more.
Right.
Plus they're dealing with just abstract constructs like the data, like a interfacing with a database, something you can't physically see, or or like this this handling this block of information that's going to exist somewhere in the cloud.
Right.
So part of my my daily responsibilities ended up including just making sure the daily builds ran fine, because we didn't have a dedicated person on our team for that, and so I had some previous experience doing that at my previous job, but still it was just kind of a thing that I would just kind of have to do on the side. My main responsibility was still software development, and that just drained me after a while.
Right.
And then I just got lucky that I later discovered there are full-time needs for a build engineer, someone who can monitor the builds and and troubleshoot build issues. And so since I had that experience, I just landed all these different opportunities, and then I discovered I actually enjoyed doing that as a full-time job. And so that's kind of what I'm doing now. I've been doing it for the last 4 years.
So I'm not a very technically inclined person. So explain to me exactly what you do that's different from, because from my perspective, I don't see the difference between what the first thing you described and the second thing you described.
Okay, so with software development, you're writing code to develop this new product, like say developing the next version of Windows or the next version of Word, something where, I mean, you say most people, if you're using Microsoft Word, you're just using the product. You might have some complaints here and there, but for the most part, when you see, if you install, when the next version of Word comes out, you install it, you see all these new features that you didn't even realize that were useful, and that's kind of how I am. Like I won't. It's hard for me to be passionate about developing a product that I don't see a need for. Whereas as a build engineer, I'm troubleshooting problems that are just right there in front of me, like
so that's like a more tangible problem that you can solve. It's not just sort of like let's try this, like let's see if we can make it do that. Like it's not all it's
Yeah.
more like you have an actual problem and you need to kind of figure out the solution to
Yeah.
the problem. So it's more a bit more tangible. Is that what it is, the difference?
There's or yeah. I mean, just yeah, just any situation where something is just clearly not working the way it should be.
Right,
Some
right.
developers' code is not compiling, and and they know, they've analyzed it, they figure out it's not their fault. It must be the build system, and that's basically my job to figure out, you know,
Okay.
and then um, just specific tasks like merge the code from this branch to this branch without breaking it. And and that requires constant problem-solving skills
Right.
with knowledge that I already have about how the system works.